When he turned his back from shoulder to shoulder, it looked like as wide as the tailgate of a truck.
And just darkness, literal darkness, just came like all over, just all over me except where I was standing.
This thing let out the most blood-curdling, mind-blowing, spine-tingling scream that you've ever heard in your life, and it cut through me like a knife.
And I knew that they were going to take me. I just knew it. And then the next thing I can remember is being levitated.
Well, when I look in there, I see two big eyes staring back at me.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Bump Podcast, a place for the believers of the unexplained, monsters, and paranormal. Join us, and we'll go face to face with what goes bump in the night. Hey there, believers. I got a fun episode for you today. It's another one about Bigfoot. Can't seem to get away from that guy. This is the second time I'm attempting to do this interview. First time, internet was sketchy. It was horrible, but hopefully I got everything fixed now. I'll be switching internet providers here the next couple of weeks, but that's another story. Today, I'm bringing on Dr. Russ Jones. He's the author of Tracking the Stone Man, showing it right there for you to see. Those of you that don't have Patreon, I guess just Google it. Tracking the Stone Man, West Virginia's Bigfoot by Dr. Russell L. Jones. We're going to go over some of the material in his book and his personal experiences and research that he does to this day with BFRO. Russell is he's a wealth of knowledge, and I just really look forward to hearing his insight. So with no further delay, we'll go ahead and bring him on the show.
Hey, this is Dr. Russ Jones. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm 56. I'm a chiropractor in Charleston, West Virginia. I've been in practice almost 30 years. I'm a certified master naturalist. I have an undergraduate biology degree, aside from my doctorate degree. And I have been interested in Bigfoot since I was a young man, and it's largely shaped a lot of my life. It decided where I came to practice, coming to West Virginia. It shaped where I bought my farm in Ohio. It's decided a lot of my life because as a young man, I had a couple of experiences and I just could not let it go. And so it's always been with me. I can't get rid of it. But what happened to me was, I grew up in this family that we were all woodsmen and outdoorsmen year round. We dug ginseng, we trapped, we had rabbit dogs, we had coon dogs. We hunted everything that was in season. And, I killed my first rabbit when I was 6, my first deer when I was 8. So, it was a big deal in my family for us to have that. But New Year's Day, we had a very bad winter storm. We got about 4 inches of snow in Southeast Ohio. It was New Year's Eve. And then New Year's Day, I went out hunting, and I was with a gentleman that was in the Army. And we were coming along a hillside. We had about 4 inches of snow, like I said, and it was one of those bluebird sunny days. It was just a beautiful day, but really cold. I came along a hillside, and I knew that there was a cave up high on this hillside. And when I came along, I saw barefooted human footprints. I did not know that there was such a thing as Bigfoot. I'd never heard of it. The gentleman that was with me, we both looked at the tracks. I just assumed that it was a vagrant that maybe had found that cave way back here in the woods and was living there. And so I walked up to it to see if there was like clothes in it or a fire, but there was nothing like that. And I remember him and I stood and talked about it for a long time. And had decided whether or not to follow the tracks or whatever. And I remember us hearing some type of yell or a noise after being there for a little while, but we just went on and kept hunting. And later that year, about 2 miles from there across country, there was a beaver dam that was remote that no one knew it was there except for my family, because the creek in the summer you could literally jump across, but about 1.5 miles or so back in the woods, it was a several acre beaver pond with great fishing. And I had been back there many times. I set turtle hooks back there, which, if anyone's not familiar with that, you take a large hook and you put a raw chicken gizzard on it and you attach it to a stick and you kind of throw it out in the water, and snapping turtles will get on there. And that was kind of delicacy in the 70s in Ohio. And I'd never had an experience, never had anything unusual happen. I was back there with an uncle fishing on that beaver dam. We were both wearing pistols because it was very snaky back there. And I was standing on an edge of the dam where maybe about 40 yards from me was the other bank, and it was very brushy there. And I had heard something coming down that hillside. I thought it was probably a deer, and I glanced at my uncle, which was maybe 30 or 40 feet from me, and I saw him watching too. And it started screaming very monkey like and shaking the bushes that were over there. It was going ooh, 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 ooh. And I said, "What do you think it is?" And he said, "Just look for a tree you can get to. It has to come across the water to get to us." And so it went on for about a minute. And after a minute, it just completely stopped. And, we were raised that there's nothing in the woods that's not more afraid of you than you are of it. So we just kept fishing. I never really thought much more of it. Later that year, Leonard Nimoy had the show In Search Of, and like so many other people, I saw the episode In Search of Bigfoot. And then I got suspicious. And 2 more times before I went to undergraduate, I'd found tracks. Once with my father when we were going to fish at roughly the same place. And another time when I was squirrel hunting, I found tracks at the edge of a right of way. And so, you're going to school. I think I was in college for around 10 years. By the time that I'd finished doctor school and I moved to West Virginia, I had literally read every book on Bigfoot that had been written at that time. And there was a Bigfoot conference in Ohio. At that time, it wasn't very large, maybe a couple hundred people. And Jeff Meldrum was speaking. It was right when his book had first came out. And so I wanted to go up. It was about a 2-hour drive from Charleston. I drove up for the day and listened to him speak and introduced myself to him and talked to him for a little bit. It was funny. I was coming home and a friend of mine said, "Well, what'd you think?" And I said, "Well, there were some pretty unique people there." And she said, "Well, I don't want to be mean, Russ, but you went to a Bigfoot conference." And, I just laughed and I knew she was right. And so, at that time, if you Google Bigfoot, the BFRO would come up, the Bigfoot Research Organization, and at one point getting around 1 million hits a month. And about 10 times a year at that point, they were doing conferences or camp out, so to speak, around the country. You would be interviewed and you'd have to sign these, forms that you wouldn't tell anybody where you were going, and they want to make sure you were serious. It was pretty expensive. I think it was like maybe $400 even then. And I thought, I'm just going to go, and worst comes to worst, they're weird, and I'm just going to leave. And I went, and at that point, Matt Moneymaker was going to him. He largely doesn't go to him anymore. He's too busy. But, Matt and I just hit it off. And I spent a lot of time with him that weekend. And then after that weekend, I started doing the reports for Ohio and West Virginia in the group. And I would say that, I was pretty sure that I thought that there was something out there. Wasn't completely sure. I hadn't really seen something. But now, all these years later, I have to say that I'm convinced that, indeed there is something out there. It was interesting. The first report that I got was a state policeman, a trooper in Raleigh County here in West Virginia, which is, in the Beckley area. And so I called him and went and talked to him. And, he'd been riding a 4-wheeler. He liked to hunt ginseng. And it was the spring of the year, but he had his wife on the back of the 4-wheeler, and they were riding a right of way. And then he would go off of it, just looking for places that in the fall when you could hunt ginseng. He could do it, but he was just at that point, just kind of looking around. And he told me that he had taken this path off the right of way, and he was putting along, and he said he saw a fire burn stump, and he didn't think much of it and continued to putt along. And he looked back at it, and he paused, and he asked me, "Have you ever seen one?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Think sheet of plywood that large."
Wow.
He said, "I'm not saying that they take people, but people disappear, and it's just so large, Russ, you can't even imagine." And he said, I had a gun, but he said, it never even occurs to you, it's too big. And I'm hitting reverse on the 4-wheeler to get out of there. My wife's like, "What are you doing?" And he said, look. And she just started screaming, "Oh my God, no. Oh my God, no." And, it was pretty traumatic for that woman. She had got some counseling. They moved into the town, as a town was, in Beckley, West Virginia, as opposed to living out in the country. And, I took him back there at night where it had happened. He was with another state trooper. They both had their guns drawn. He was chain smoking. He was crying. And I thought, he saw something, or, he believes he saw something. And, in West Virginia, we get about, Ohio gets about a report, maybe 2 a week. And I'm not saying a legitimate great report, but, just a report that's probably in all likelihood someone is misidentified something. Or since the TV show, Finding Bigfoot was on, I've helped with that TV show several times and been on it, I think 4 times. Prior to that show, really, most people didn't even know that Bigfoot really made a sound.
Right.
Some people knew what Bigfoot was, but, then for a long time when that show was on there, all the reports we would get would be like something along these lines. "I've been in the woods my whole life. I heard this sound. I've never heard anything like it. And I know all the animals." And a lot of them, probably 75% of them, were like that. But, in West Virginia, we were probably getting maybe a report every couple weeks. And probably, like I said, the great majority of them are misidentification, but about 2 or 3 times a year in Ohio or West Virginia, you would get a report that was remarkable, that was a doctor, a state trooper, a game warden, a very experienced, bright person that was well-spoken.
Yeah.
And, and you live for those reports. And that's one of the interesting things about Bigfoot is, the witnesses really largely don't have anything in common. The most common sighting is a road crossing. We have one place in West Virginia where there's been 5 road crossings. That's the most that I know of.
Where's that at?
But that's on Interstate 64 around Alta, near Lewisburg, West Virginia.
Okay, that's a good spot.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was trying to figure out why there were so many road crossings there. And not very far from there is a butcher house.
Oh, wow.
So, I don't know if it has anything to do with that or whether it's just, there's kind of some caves through there, and, and there's a valley that goes through there, it's kind of a good place for the wildlife to cross. So I'm not really sure. The second most common place that we ever had sightings, one would be on the road to Cranberry Wilderness area, around Falls in the Hills, that area, Kennison Mountain. And then we had up by Seneca Rocks, which is a very beautiful place in West Virginia. on the steep mountain going into it. One year there was 4 sightings in 1 week on the road.
Oh my God.
Yeah, probably in all likelihood, with me guessing, it's probably a juvenile male, maybe extending his territory.
Mhm.
And, and that was probably the deal there. But now, if I'm seeing patients and I get a call, my staff knows that I will, fortunately I have younger doctors that work in my office, but, I will leave immediately if I think there's a chance for me to go see footprints that are fresh, or something like that.
Right.
I've largely have quit ambulance chasing for years. I had my game cameras, which is kind of what I'm known for, I would say, across the country. I've got 36 game cameras out, all of them expensive. And I had them from the high mountains of West Virginia into South Central Ohio. And I spent most of my free time just visiting, moving cameras. I try to keep them out in location for a year at a time, assuming that the animals probably aren't staying in that area all the time, that they're kind of moving through.
Right.
So that's what I've been doing now is, trying to figure that out, still managing all those camera traps. Instead of being in Ohio 1 week, one weekend, and next weekend I'm in Otter Creek Wilderness area or Cranberry or whatever it happens to be. Now I've limited myself to just 2 or 3 areas at a time. And I try to spend all my time and all my cameras in that area. And what that has helped me do is know the wildlife better and the people that are in that forest better, to get an idea and understanding of how it goes. Of course, I want a picture of Bigfoot on one of my cameras, but the reality is I've learned that many times I'm gathering other information that even if I'm not getting a picture of a Bigfoot, because maybe they hear my camera or they smell my camera or that looks like an eye or whatever it happens to be, the reason why we don't get the picture, I have opinions about that. But, I'll have a camera, for instance, I pulled one last week, if people have seen the big special episode of Finding Bigfoot that's on Discovery Plus right now, after they were off a couple of years, they did this big, reunited type show. And I'd helped with that show, and some of the witnesses on there were mine. And
I was
I've
one
been
of
friends
them.
with those guys. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for
That's
that,
right.
by the way.
You
That
were
was
there.
fun.
Yeah. And so, some of our mutual friends, were on the show, and they spent a lot of time at Kanawha State Forest.
Yeah.
And I'd had cameras in Kanawha for probably, 10 years in different parts of the park, and had never gotten anything, for whatever reason. I was trying different things out in different areas. And so I put a camera out. There was last summer, we had about 4 or 5 different incidents of sightings, footprints being found, that type of thing. And so I moved a camera in closer to the main part of the park where I would never be at. And so I pulled it last week, and it had been out 11 months. It took around 3,300 pictures.
Wow.
And usually a Reconyx camera with lithium batteries, depending upon how many deer are moving through and taking shots up, most of the time I'm getting somewhere between, I'd say 9 months and maybe a year and a half almost worth of cameras. Sometimes I'm looking at 4,000 or 5,000 pictures at a setting. And it's been interesting to be able to do it. Like I said, there's things that you don't know. There's some parks that are in Ohio that the rangers know now that there's, say, wild boar in those parks that they didn't know that were in that park before, or they didn't know they were in that area before. And I have found that many times, like in Kanawha, for instance, on the camera that I looked at for 11 months, every single day I had pictures of deer numbering between 20 and 23 every single day.
Wow.
And so it's like that at a lot of other places I have cameras out. You'll see certain, maybe 2 or 3 coyotes that come through, or a bobcat, or whatever it happens to be. But a lot of times you'll see these things coming through on a regular type schedule, like the deer being so many a day. But then if you watch and you take notes of what you're doing, you'll find that there's certain times that you won't have those. So I noticed, like, for instance, in Kanawha, in that area of the park, the first week of September, I had no deer for a solid week.
That's odd.
But the whole rest of the 11 months, I had, 20 or above every single day.
Right.
So for me, that would mean that there was something in that area that was messing with the wildlife and disturbing it. And so I keep notes on those, and I try to go to those areas in these different parks during that time that something is odd in there. And I'll keep it on my calendar. Each park or each set of woods that I'm in, or national park or national forest, what time of the year that happens, I'll keep in there all the Bigfoot sightings that are from me or from different groups. And we'll try to be there at that same time as well, just trying to increase my odds a little bit of bumping into something.
Yeah.
And largely always doing it during the day, because, a lot of people have heard me say, just when you're going out at night, you're going out for an experience, because there's very, very little evidence that's collected at night.
Right.
But, I can see where it's important. People are paying for expeditions. That's how we develop the younger people that are going to be the people that continue along to follow us. They go out in the woods, they have an experience, something they can't explain. That's exciting. And, you do that for years and years and years, but at some point you've had enough experiences and you just want to have, you want to get to the bottom of it.
Right. Yep.
And so then at that point, I find I don't go to as many seminars or, that type of thing that I would do. I was getting where I was speaking all the time. And it was funny, 2 years ago, I was speaking at the large Ohio gathering, which, went from a couple hundred people to where a few years ago they had 6,000 people through there in the weekend. And they had 4 speakers, and it was, I don't even remember exactly who it was, other than I know that it was myself, and I think Jeff Meldrum was there, and I think Cliff Barrickman was there, and someone else would have been there. And so I was having lunch with Cliff, and we were talking, and he's like, so what do you got going on now in the woods? And I was saying, well, I got 30 something cameras out, and I have these feed stations I've got out. I've got these places that I'm putting rocks and marbles and cliffs and overhangs, and I've got mirrors out in the woods, large mirrors that are hanging in different angles and stuff. I said, I'm just trying all these things. And he's like, man, I don't hardly get to go out anymore. I'm speaking all the time. And I was listening to him, and I thought, I don't have to do this. I already got a job.
Right. Yeah.
And so when I got back, I canceled several more places that I was scheduled to speak. And I said, I'm just not doing this for a while. I've got a second book coming out. I don't know. I'll probably get done with them. 150 pages in now. So probably later this year over the winter, I'll get done with it. And, then maybe I will do some speaking again. But, I really just want to be in the woods. I am not as patient as being at conferences where, we're just talking about it. I want to actually be out there and try to resolve it and try to come up with,
Yeah, absolutely.
something. It gets frustrating. And I think that's how people do as we age in Bigfoot world. You start out and you're young and you're hungry, and maybe you're, you're single and you don't have children. And then as time goes on, life becomes more complicated, and with your job and with your personal life and everything else that, you're trying to juggle all that in. And, cause it's not like anybody's really researching Bigfoot for a living.
Right.
Right. There's probably a few people like Cliff, or maybe, I don't even know who else would be, maybe Bobo, that are making a living doing it, through some means. But, largely all the rest of us, Jeff Meldrum, all of us have jobs that are our priority.
Because it's an expensive hobby too. I mean,
yeah.
And it's a very expensive passion if you get into it as deep as like you are. Like you're saying, these Reconyx cameras, I hunt. I have a couple of game cameras, but I'm not sticking Reconyx out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I have, I think 32 Reconyx, and they started the HC 600s several years ago, and then it went to HC 500s. Now they have the Hyperfire, and the Hyperfires are cheaper. So they're like $399. And then of course you put a Cobra Python lock on them, which is like $20, you know, so you got a lot of money invested.
Yeah.
And you put 12 lithium batteries in it, which are $20, and you're, you know, maybe another $10 for your SD card, and you have a lot out there. But, you know, largely when most of my cameras were in West Virginia, I was seldom ever losing a camera. And to be honest, I went about 5 years where I didn't even see a human on any of my cameras. I was in such remote locations.
Wow. That's
And, but as time has changed and I've evolved my strategy, particularly in Ohio, you know, there's one park right now I have 11 cameras in, and I shift them according to the time of year where I know certain things happen, just trying to get a picture. But, you know, as for instance, you know, just this past year, I had 5 cameras in this close area because, you know, there had been some sightings and I had heard some things when I had been in there. I had heard the samurai chatter. I had heard wood knocks myself. And I had 2 cameras that during 2 different weeks in a 6-month period had no deer, had no nothing. The same thing that I was telling you previously that made me suspicious, you know, that they were in there during that time. But it was interesting. I was telling you before that I had this recently had this thing happen, the story. I had lost a camera in this area, and this is the second most remote area in all of Ohio. And I have probably 4 cameras out in the most remote area. And then, you know, several cameras out in this other area. Well, I've been putting peanut butter out, you know, Tom Shea, which is, you know, he's a researcher in Kentucky, and Tom has probably got more footprint casts than anybody in the nation so far. And, you know, I had talked to him quite a few times on occasion, and he was talking about that. And I thought, you know, what's the harm in putting Nutella or peanut butter out? And so I would just go to Dollar General or wherever, and, you know, it was $1 for a jar, and I'd duct tape it to a tree. Some I would put a camera on, some I would not put a camera on, just mixing things up. And a year ago, next month, I lost a camera. I'm not exactly sure how the camera disappeared. I don't know if, you know, at one point I believe that if people took those master tool type things, that they could kind of pry them off.
right.
And so I wasn't sure if, you know, if something had taken it off or if that happened, but I had a really good setup in this remote location that I cut these branches and trimmed them. And so it was really hidden. And I put these collared rocks on this stump, and I was just trying to get something to mess with them. Well, the camera disappeared. And so, you know, I still have other cameras out in there. And then of course I have peanut butter, you know, maybe 2 or 3 out there. I don't remember exactly how many. And several months ago, I had one of my peanut butters disappear. And Tom had told me his experience had been that the peanut butter would disappear. Then after a period of time, you would find the peanut butter in the general area with the lid back on, but it would be empty. And yeah, so I really had not had an experience where something had taken my peanut butter. But, you know, like as a researcher, I think we have to try all these things. You know, we got to come up with different ideas. We just can't keep doing the same thing. So, you know, we should be sitting down, trying to come up with dozens of ideas of different things, of looking at different things. Like, for instance, the cameras, I think that they hear. I think there's some studies that show that, you know, the Chinese have some rainforest that have some endangered species in. They're trying to find some undocumented. You know, they tested all the game cameras in the United States. They found out the Reconyx was the least noisy, because you can imagine the noisier something is, it's wasting energy. So as a result, the battery life is not as long.
Right.
And so the average camera is around 30 decibels. So for you and me, we probably can't hear it, but younger kids probably could hear it. So animals probably hear it. So now, you know, I've concentrated on trying to get those cameras maybe closer to noisemakers like creeks or different things like that. But nonetheless, so I lost this peanut butter finally. Had no idea. Well, I was out in the woods coming through this deer trail. I got to the tree where I had lost the camera on a year ago, and the lid of my peanut butter was leaning up against the tree, but the peanut butter had been 3/4 of a mile away.
That's pretty incredible.
So yeah, so it was interesting, like I think that they're one of the reasons why we don't get pictures of them is I just don't think that they're as common as what people think they are. In West Virginia and Ohio, maybe there's 125, 150 or so, just guessing.
Yeah.
And so, that would mean there would be like a family group in each county. And so you can imagine 25 miles by 25 miles and your dog gets loose. It's hard to find. Imagine if it's an animal that has been raised there that's, they're curious of humans, but generally leery of humans. And they've been raised to know where people go and where people don't go. I mean, it'd be hard to get around them. So, I don't think that they're in the woods every time we go. I don't think that they always know, that we're there when they go. They're so large that, it'd be hard for one area to sustain enough food, but it makes sense to me that, that they would kind of, I don't believe really in kind of a migration type thing so much as say they were moving through an area that's maybe a couple counties or something, and they're following, Bo's Orchard has apples in September, and his family, some other family in 50 miles away or 20 miles away has an enormous garden, and maybe the salmon are running in a certain area at a certain time. And there's just different things, and I think that because they're large, I think a lot of their life revolves around food, and they're moving along with that food. So it's hard to imagine they'd stay in one particular area unless there might be somebody like somebody that's feeding them unknowingly or knowingly, a habituator.
Right.
Largely, that would be the only way it would probably happen. But it was funny. I was talking to a friend of mine, Brad Kennan, out of Ohio, and I told him about that peanut butter lid being there. And he said, well, to me, they were telling you that they didn't like your camera, but they did like your peanut butter.
That makes sense.
Yeah, who knows?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, like I said, I've read your book. It's one of the few books that I've actually read twice. I just want to pull out as much as I could for, you have a lot of like solid information in here. You get into real good descriptions. I thoroughly enjoy it. And reading it, it's very clear, and you make no bones about it, that this is a primate, nothing more, nothing less, you said. How did you land on that? I know you're a doctor. I know you follow the scientific approach, but what brought you to land solidly on primate, especially like we were talking before I started recording? There's so much the big trend of the woo factor going on with lights being accompanied with Bigfoot sightings and footprints just dead ending in the middle of an open field, those kind of things. And I'm not here to question you. I'm just asking, for your insight, because you got a lot more experience out there than I do or ever will probably. So.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, it's interesting, say, largely, probably one of the very first people that was interested in the paranormal aspect was Tom Powell, which is a friend of mine from California. And of course, Tom has written a couple of great books and, is really a bright, cool guy that, I like and admire. But he was in the BFRO then, would take some of those reports that everybody else was ignoring because they were weird. But largely, we did not see woo become popular, common until the last several years. Prior to that, it was strictly a flesh and blood type thing. And then all at once, this has exploded. I think that this is just my opinion.
Yeah.
I think that people are not in the woods much anymore. I hardly know anyone that's very much in the woods at all. Maybe some hunters that, they bow hunt a little bit and they gun hunt a little bit, but other than that, they're not much in the woods. But, here in West Virginia, it's rare for people to be farther than a quarter mile from the nearest road or trail. And in fact, Pennsylvania did a study with GPS, and they found that, as they're over 99% of the hunters never went farther than a quarter mile from the road or trail. And I think that that's the way it is for most people. I mean, we're at a time in society where people are afraid of getting lost. They're afraid of the dark. They're afraid of snakes. They don't want to shoot a deer over a hillside and have to drag it up the hillside. People don't have as much time as what they did. And quite frankly, hunting isn't as popular. And so I don't believe that, for instance, like yesterday I was on Twitter and some guy posted this tree break. And so, he's like, shows a picture of a tree break. And I sent a message and said, well, how it's a Bigfoot, man? He's like, the angle is broke. I've seen many like this before. But, the woods is full of tree litter is what I call it.
Yeah.
That Joe Beelart, the Road Oregon Bigfoot Highway, said that maybe 1 in a million tree breaks mean something in the woods. I believe that the primates, the higher primates, some of them do stick structures and break things and mark things and things like that. But let's face it, if they did it all the time and if it was common, our forefathers would have recognized it and they would have hunted them all down like they did everything else.
That's true.
And these guys, our great grandfathers, they were good in the woods. They recognized the trees, how the animals ate. And now people aren't like that. I mean, I see those things in the woods and I always wonder, does that person even know what kind of tree that is? Do they even know what kind of diseases attach that tree? I mean, are they carrying, like a lot of times I have a little magnifying glass that I'm looking at breaks and, they look clean and it looks like a good tree. But once you get under a microscope, you can tell it's diseased or it has animals or little bugs that you couldn't see otherwise. And so I think that people go out, they don't have anything happen, and then they start attaching something woo to it. And I can say that as much time as I've been in the woods, which is a lot of time every single week, year round, that I have never had something happen to me that I could not explain. Now, I'm not discounting what other people have said that they have experienced. Right. I personally have just never had anything like that happen. And I still take the reports and I still listen to what people say. But, what has been my experience is people will have a sighting or something they believe that is Bigfoot related, and then everything becomes Bigfoot related. So I think that woo is lazy. Woo is an excuse. It is because we're not the woodsmen that we used to be, and because we're not in the woods that much. I mean, some of these expeditions, that I go on or that, I'm being paid to go on and lead people. I mean, people think everything is a Bigfoot, every little sound in the woods or something they hear, people are just not familiar with what the animals are like and what they sound like in the woods or whatever it happens to be. Now that being said, I think that the old timers were unaware of noises and sounds that Bigfoot made. And I think many of them probably had experiences, but because they didn't know about it or recognize it, just didn't know. I can remember when I would be coon hunting with my grandfather, and we coon hunted all the time, and we would have hundreds of coons that we had harvested each year. That's how often we were out. And, we would be laying in this remote forest in Ohio where there's nothing but a gravel road for miles with no lights on, sitting on a hillside eating an apple, waiting for our dogs to bark, and would hear a wood knock. And I can remember that number of times. And I'd ask my grandfather what it was, and he would say that it was the way the hollows ran. It made car door slamming funny and noises funny, and it was a car door from some distance away. But that's what he believed.
Right.
Now I think that if he was still alive and he had a chance to talk to me and spend time, or maybe just had more experience, maybe there have been some other things that he would have felt differently about.
Yeah. 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 And that's natural. People, if they haven't experienced it, or they rationalize it by what they know, nothing wrong with that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I think that it's just, here we're having something that, we're trying to convince scientists that there's something else out there, and, it requires extraordinary proof. And not only do we not really have the extraordinary proof, then we have groups of people inside our body of Bigfooters, largely a citizen scientist group that are talking about things that scientists aren't comfortable with. And there are scientists that are interested in Bigfoot and that talk about it privately. But they don't want to be involved with, the orbs or, some of the different things that, people associate with that. And like I said, I know that there's really bright people have had experiences happen, and, and I'm not sure how they explain that, but as soon as I will have something happen, then maybe, I will have some type of belief about that.
Right. Yeah.
But I still think it's important to talk to them. I still think that we should take the notes. We should hear what they're saying. We should look at it. It should be included in our body of work or whatever it happens to be. But it's clouded the research that's out there right now.
Yeah. You want to get down to the fundamentals before you want to entertain all this extra stuff, right? You want to?
Yeah. I've never seen, I probably find tracks like, in Ohio, West Virginia, and Appalachia. It's not easy to find tracks, if we have leaf litter everywhere, our hills are steep. So I would say about 3 or 4 times a year, I would find a track that was as good as what you would see on the internet. But, it would be rare for you to find more than a couple of tracks. And, I'd say that I'm probably aware of, say, last year, maybe 15 or 20 tracks found in Ohio or West Virginia.
Wow.
But, let's say that you have a track and you want to send it to somebody like Jeff Meldrum, which, is obviously who everybody would consider the expert on footprints. It's gotten to a point now that, unless Jeff knows you personally, he's probably not going to say, he's going to say something like, well, it's interesting or it's compelling. He's not able to say definitively, what it's going to be.
Well, one reason is Dr. Meldrum's come out and he's told you all these things that he looks for. So if there is a hoaxer out there, they're going to try to up their game to match the things that he's, identified, with the dermal ridges and all that stuff, and the break in the foot. And, so he has to be more skeptical to people he doesn't know. It just makes
we've had some people that have produced some fake tracks that are compelling, that experts have been wrong on. But just from a common standpoint, it just doesn't seem reasonable to me that there's, for instance, in nature, we find that everything, it's a law of nature that everything largely is larger as you get farther from the equator. So a deer that's in Florida is smaller than a deer in Canada, and so forth and so on. It's escaping me now. It shouldn't be. It's in my book, and I talk about it all the time, but what the name of the law is. But, does it make it reasonable sense then that people that are faking or hoaxing, that they know that an average track found in the South on average is smaller than the average track that's in the North, and they're reproducing it that way? I just don't believe that. I don't believe that people will fake a track that's 4 miles from the nearest trail, because what are the odds that someone like me, as much as I'm out, is going to come across that exact spot? I believe that these animals are cognizant. Mountain lions, monkeys are cognizant of leaving their footprints.
Yeah.
And I remember I took this one report, it was around Lewisburg, West Virginia. And this logger was out. He had broken down on his bulldozer, and he was messing with his bulldozer, and he had sent his guys to get it apart. When his guys came back and they're driving through these fields and stuff, and when they topped this mountain, they looked down, and this guy was out in an opening working on his dozer, and there was a forest completely around him. Well, where they came over the hill in this field, they thought it was a bear, and it was, it was a couple hundred yards from that guy, but it was peeking around a tree. I mean, imagine how cagey that is. I mean, the guy's working on something. He's not looking around. Even if he looks around, he's not going to see something standing in this forest. But, here's something that's a couple hundred yards away, peeking to see the guy. And then they thought it was a bear. And then, it turned and saw him or whatever, and then took off running. And they realized it wasn't a bear. And when I got to their logging road, their landing road, it jumped it. Rather than just running like it would normally, people would, it jumped it, cognizant of not leaving a footprint.
Yep.
And so I can't tell you how many loggers that, have came into my office as patients over the years that they all know that I'm interested, and their dozers parked, so far back in when they get to work each day, you're usually not driving it out. And I'm like, well, every day when you walk in those roads, I need you to look for me. And if you see something that isn't a bear track, I need to know about it. And of course, in West Virginia, bears are common. There's around 17,000 of them. In Ohio is probably one of those states with, around 100 resident bears now. There might be more Bigfoot than there are bears.
Right.
Which may be the only state in the country that's like that. So, but I've developed some of my own beliefs and theories that have helped me find things over the years. I talk about perches in the book. It's a term that I coined. And I found it many, many times. And what that is I believe that they go after trash. They go after, like say if there's a place on a lake that's a dead end road and a bunch of people fish there, or maybe people park there and they throw out their trash, or say in a park like Canal, they have a shooting range and it's at the end of a dead end road and there's a trash can there. I believe they visit things like that.
Yeah.
And so they will go to a location before dark that they can see kind of reminds me of a bird sitting in his perch, looking down or looking about so that they can see when people leave and no one is there. And many times when you go to those locations, if you're looking at a map of a lake, you can just pick out a spot that looks like what I'm talking about. It's usually always connected to a large wood. So like, let's say that we were looking at, Summersville Lake or Saleski in Ohio or wherever it happens to be, and you're looking at it on a map, you can see there's areas of a campground that, it would be dangerous for something to get into. It'd be easy for them to be seen, but you can spot an area or two of the park where there's a lot of woods coming there that they'd be able to sneak into that area comfortably. And that's the areas, that I would concentrate on when I pull up there. I'm like, okay, if Cliff Barrickman would say, if he was a sniper, where would he sit at or whatever? I call it a perch. And so, I drive into these areas and then, usually there's one or two things. And if you get up in the woods and look, a lot of times, you'll be able to find something. I remember one time I was doing an interview for a magazine and the gentleman brought a park map and had me pick out 2 locations. And so we went to this park to look for what I was talking about. Well, one was around a campground. It was during the winter, so it was closed. The gate was closed. We couldn't get in. Well, we went to the other one where I had picked out, and I'd picked it because there was 2 like shelter houses that's in a remote area of the park. And if you were up in the woods, you could literally go for several miles crossing no roads or paths. So it was a good place to get into. And, if a Bigfoot is in that area and let's say there's a playground and, people are eating and stuff, I mean, how could it resist,
Right.
being up in the woods watching and, maybe at night trying to scavenge some of that food. And, so we went there and I asked that writer, I said, so, if you were here and you were going to watch people, where would you be at? And he pointed out the spot. And I said, okay, well, let's go up and look. And we went up there and we found behind a tree, there was a bunch of glass that had been broken and was stacked in a stack of rocks. And there was a golf ball that was up in the woods that was sitting right on this mound of dirt that, you know, if it was a quarter inch either way, it would roll off.
Yeah.
And so, you know, is it evidence of Bigfoot? No, but it's compelling. And so you would periodically go back to that spot to see whether or not something is up there, something has changed. Maybe you put out a game camera there to see if you can get lucky and get a picture of something. So that's the type of things, you know, that I would keep on my calendar all the time. So if I have, say, a date in July and I haven't had an experience or no one's had a sighting, then I'm going to these locations like that I suspect that they could be at. And in just a couple of minutes, I can usually walk around and see whether or not, because they're not everywhere,
Right.
you know, so, you know, I can find out whether or not they're visiting that spot and try to figure out when it is.
That's great. That's great. And I've actually taken that advice. My father-in-law, he's got about 100 acres, you know, in Logan County. It's all woods.
Yes.
And last year I went out and looked for a couple perches, and I found the areas like you were describing. I didn't find much else. You know, I might find, you know, some looks like an area where something might have bedded down or something like that. But I'm taking your advice. You know what I mean? That's what I'm trying to get at. I take your advice. And I'm looking around with that.
A lot of times you'll see little sticks where they have broken off. You know, they're standing behind a tree and they're just piddling around.
Yeah.
You know, but I mean, I think the first thing whenever I'm going to a sighting or a location is I'm always thinking, you know, why on all the places that we could be. And, you know, and I think I told you before that I had the biggest hoax case I ever saw came out of Logan, West Virginia, down your way. And, you know, and so when I went there, just like many places, I'm looking around, I'm thinking, you know, why is a Bigfoot going to be in this location? You know, I mean, what is it that's so spectacular? Or when I have a road crossing somewhere up in the mountains, I'm thinking, you know, why is it going to be here? You know, what is it that, you know, would cause them to be interested in, you know? And another thing I talk about is treat foods. So like some of the people that are interested in Bigfoot would say, well, you know, they're eating deer. So if you can find a big deer herd, then, you know, there's a good chance there'll be Bigfoot around. Well, in Appalachia, I mean, that's not helpful. There's deer everywhere. Deer are very common and they're everywhere. So it's just not a helpful thing. But what is helpful, if you start thinking about what are food sources that aren't readily available all year, that would be a treat for something to have, especially a sugar, which is hard to find, you know, in nature. So then if you start thinking about like, so, you know, here we are in July, you know, Ohio and West Virginia through Appalachia, our berries are becoming ripe.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're thinking about right of ways that four-wheelers can't get to that have large berry populations that you have to walk a little bit to get to, that has a history of Bigfoot sightings in the general area.
Yeah.
You know, apple trees, orchards that are, you know, ripe at whatever time they get ripe. You know, we have ramps, we have mushrooms. You know, mushrooms are around. Largely December is about the hardest month to get them, but other than that, they're around all the time. You know, but looking for those food sources that they can't find. For instance, I'm very interested in right now, the parks are full. I'm interested in parks that have a lot of campgrounds and cabins that have dumpsters and things like that with large woods attached to them.
Yeah, it's something that you just now mentioned, cabins with dumpsters. A few years ago, and I didn't put it together till we were sitting here talking. And I'm not saying it was Bigfoot either, but up here at Chief Logan, on the wildlife preserve on the other side here, they put up a series of cabins. Well, a few years ago, while they were finishing up the cabins, there's a dirt road that they have blocked off now, I'm sure, that I used to go out and go hunting on. Anywhere in that wildlife management area is fair game. You know, you hunt like a regular season. Well, I went back there and it was between a half to a full mile in a direct shot from those cabins. I found a trash can, you know, that was pulled off a site. You know, you could see like fast food stuff down in it. And at that time I thought, man, a bear really went out of its way to drag this can this far.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just where I left it. You know, like, well, there must be a bear around. I'm not bear hunting. I'm looking for a deer. You know,
That's right.
but
I think you're right. I think a lot of people, unless they had a Bigfoot knowledge, because most of us in bear country would say, you know, bears aren't dragging trash cans a half mile away or a mile away. You know, they're dumping it over and going through everything right then, just like raccoons are. You know what I mean? So it's not evidence of Bigfoot, but it's certainly suspicious and something to keep in mind. You know, that they were during the weather, whenever they were allowing those camper people to be in there. You know, like I might have talked to the park ranger and say, I found the trash can in the woods. When did you guys lose that? Just to find out, you know, when it was.
right.
So, you know, then it makes me suspicious they're following that particular trail or area. I mean, I had, as you know, cameras in Chief Logan for years, and the area I think that you were talking up is near the Wilderness Trail.
Mm-hmm.
And then they put that road up over the mountain, which is like got to be the steepest road in West Virginia.
Yeah, the worst.
And yeah, and it's, you know, it's sad because I know it made access to people to be able to get to the lodge to eat and stuff, but man, they took some of the most remote areas right there in the park out.
Yeah, it went right through the Wilderness Trail.
Yeah, and you know, there was there's elk down there. Even before they started releasing elk in West Virginia, there was elk around Chief Logan area, and I'd seen elk poop. And man, I never even got an elk on one of my cameras. You know, and I was looking for them or trying to get it.
Right.
But you know, there's a lot of places in Appalachia states that are hard to get to. In West Virginia, Panther Creek State Park has a history of Bigfoot sightings. Horrible place to get to from anywhere in West Virginia.
Yeah. It's
you know, and then we have places, Chief Logan is a great place for people to go. There's always reports that come out of Chief Logan, particularly in the fall. There'll be sound noises come out of there. I have been 2 different times I've heard wood knocks in Chief Logan, but have not seen anything in there, like so many things. But, you know, some of my friends say, well, you know, what if you would find, if you got to the end of your life and you were lucky enough to make it to heaven, and, you know, of course, the first question out of your mouth after you say thank you is, you know, is there Bigfoot? And, you know, and what if he said, no, there's no such thing, or it doesn't exist or whatever, then, you know, I mean, in my mind, I just enjoy being in the woods so much that it wouldn't have been a loss for me, because just that time is worth so much to me. And, you know, really, I'm not whole in my personal life if I'm not getting out enough, you know? And so for me, that means at least 2 to 3 days a week, I'm trying to be out for several hours. And then at least every couple months, I'm going to be off a week, and I'm going to try to spend most of that whole week in the woods.
That's the way to live, man. That's the way to live.
Yeah.
I don't get to take that much time away from the family, but I do take a couple weeks out of the year just to go out. You know, I'll go camp a little bit, go fish every opportunity I get, and hunting season, you know, it's on the weekends basically, but I try to go almost every weekend. But yeah, man.
Do you ever get to the point where you get consumed though, like with, you know, especially like the Bigfoot thing, you know, you want to, you know more? I mean, for instance, there was 3 weeks ago now, it might've been 4 weeks, there was a sighting of a juvenile Bigfoot on the road going to Babcock State Park in West Virginia, and 2 cars following each other that didn't know each other both witnessed it and saw it.
Wow. Yes.
And it was a 3 foot tall Bigfoot running across the road that was an orangish brown color.
Wow.
And, you know, so you get those, and, you know, people that don't live in Appalachia, you know what I mean? In Appalachia, every place is a good place for Bigfoot and could be anywhere.
Yeah.
And so it's tempting to go running up there, but I've been to these sites many times hours after the sighting, and, you know, the Bigfoot's not there. You might have found the footprint. But, you know, you wouldn't find anything. I can remember one year I was, had went to this place, and I gotten called, and, this lady was a teacher, and she went outside. She had a headache. And, when she stepped outside, she smell to smell. And, of course, that's common with, you hear it with Bigfoots. The reality is about 15% of the reports have a smell associated with it. And people generally believe, the great apes will have a gland called an apomere gland that when something is frightened or as something is nervous, it puts the smell off. And, so sometimes those of us that have been in the woods, will smell something or whatever, but it may or may not be associated with Bigfoot activity. And so she stepped out on there. She said that she told me that she thought that her dogs had gotten a creek and they were always laying underneath her porch. And she thought all dogs got underneath the porch again or in the creek again. And when she looked up, she had a dusk to dawn light, and standing there, she said, was a Bigfoot just standing there looking at her, and not very far, maybe 40 yards from her. And as soon as they made eye contact, it just started walking, and it walked through the freshly tilled garden that they had. And so, the next day, then I was up there to look at it. But it was funny. I mean, I think that, people are as interested about the Bigfoot people as they are about the Bigfoot himself. They're curious about, who's going to show up at their house. That's the Bigfoot guy.
Probably.
And so that's what I was saying earlier, if I had some advice, it would be to choose a spot that has a history that you can get to spend time regularly, and spend as much time as you can in that location and get to know that area better rather than just being all over the place. And I know my good friend, Matt Pruitt, Matt has said the same thing. And I know him and I both had regrets that we spent a lot of years ambulance chasing reports. Just a good report would come in and, you'd be just wanting to get there. And, like one time a logger, he had this guy with him. This guy was the youngest sheriff in the history of Florida. And he was from West Virginia. He retired. He was pretty young, but he came back home. And he went with this logger just to spend the day driving, just to catch up and talk with him. They're driving along this road, and there's a creek next to the road and a kind of a brushy field next to it. And then one guy is looking across there. And when he got down the road, he stopped about 100 feet. And he said, "Did you just see what I saw?" And the guy said, "Did you see Bigfoot down on one knee drinking with water out of his hand?" And he said, "Yeah, that's what I saw."
Oh my.
And so when you hear that, I just have to go.
Yeah, man.
And
Yeah.
And so I'm there and I'm at that spot and I'm looking around, but like there's just nothing there anymore. But I mean, a lot of times it haunts you. Like the place where I had experiences where I got yelled at when I was younger, probably a couple times a year, I will walk into that place before dark and just sit. It's when you're an outdoorsman, a woodsman, and you've always spent your life in the woods, annoying everybody in your family because you're walking down a creek and you're like, "What kind of track is that? What kind of track is that? It's a red fox." "Well, how do you know it's not a gray fox? How can you tell the difference?" Just bothering these people that are in your life that are woodsmen too. And then you have an experience happen to you that you can't explain, and it just eats at you and shapes your life, affects where you live, how you spend your free time. I think that, when I was writing the book, my whole thought was, like when I went over what I believe that Bigfoot probably was, it was a few pages. I could have literally done pages on every single one, but it wasn't the point. The point I was trying to get was that if just someone just sat down and read your book and you just laid out some of the evidence that was around and some that you found compelling, that by the time they got to the end of the book, they'd say, who knows? I mean, maybe, maybe it's something we should look at. As opposed to, people in New York City. I mean, it's funny, in Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, around 2/3 of the people believe in Bigfoot. But if you take the national numbers, it's like 27% or 30%, depending on where you read. But, they're including people that live in Miami Beach and Chicago and New York. Right. I mean, they've never in their whole lives been in a woods quarter mile from the nearest road or trail or spent time somewhere, but yet they, have an opinion about this animal. In one interview I was doing, the gentleman said, well, it just seems like that if something was like that out there, we would have found it. I'm like, man, I'm still trying to figure out, who someone is. I mean, there's no one in the woods.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there used to be, and it was really common, but it's just not that common anymore. There's a lot of places that that people aren't around. I mean, I can tell you because of literally a decade of running double-digit cameras in the most remote areas, there's places, and even places like Ohio, that have a large population that only see a person, maybe one person or two people in a whole year will go past a spot. I'm sure there's places where, there's not any, but I mean, the point being is that, there's places in West Virginia where you can go, 17 or 18 miles in between roads.
Yes.
Very steep, inhospitable terrain that's full of briars and brush and snakes and everything else that people are not getting to.
Yeah.
So certainly there's plenty of room for them. There's plenty of food for them. I think that the only argument that people make largely is, why we don't have a body. And other than that argument there's really not a reasonable argument. I mean, anybody that's a naturalist or a scientist knows there's plenty of food. If elk and deer and bear and everything else are surviving year round, then these animals could too.
Right.
It's just a matter of, how they're going about it and how they're doing it.
Yeah. And over the last 30 years, our bear population has boomed, and I think it was it Cliff that associates, bear population versus Sasquatch population. If there's like 50 black bear, there, 50 to 1 kind of ratio or something like that.
It's 100 to 1.
100 to 1.
I think that was Grover Krantz, the professor from Washington State anthropology, that had posed that. And the BFRO has, another number that they look at, and it's slightly lower. So I know using those two numbers in West Virginia, the number would be between 150 to 225 Bigfoot. Right. Using that number. And I think that seems like a reasonable number. I mean, it's funny because that seems to a lot of people like a large number, but when you say there's 17,000 bears and you ask, when's the last time you saw a bear? I mean, people don't commonly see them.
Right.
Most people aren't around that much unless you're in some park where people are feeding them and the bears are hanging out there, or at a mine. A lot of times people will feed the bears and keep them around. So I think that, it would be a similar type thing. They're omnivores, they're opportunistic, they're eating whatever they can. They're eating roadkill, they're eating in dumps. And I think that it's appealing for them once they get that taste of sugar, just as humans have gotten addicted to the sugar. I think that they would too. Mm-hmm. And, it's hard to find a honey tree in nature, and it's hard to find berries beyond, a couple of weeks.
Right.
So I think that they're after those leftover cheeseburger buns and things like that the campers have around.
Yeah. I agree with you. Well, Russ, I really appreciate you doing this with me. I've already had you on here for over an hour, and this is the second time you've done this. So I really appreciate it. We'll go ahead and wrap things up for this time. Is there anything that you want people to know? Any place you want them to go to find your book? Any more information on the release of your next book?
They can find the book on Amazon or eBay. All the state parks in West Virginia, Tamarack, all have the book. It sold over 5,000 copies, which is really good for a Bigfoot book.
Yes, it is.
It'll, especially a regional one. So the next book probably would be next year. It's interesting. The publisher was trying to get me to do one on all of Appalachia. My plan was to go to, say I went to Tennessee and I talked to Matt Pruitt or whoever I considered the best investigator from that state. Then I try to interview the witness that had the best report from that state. And then I would spend a day and a night in their best territory and write it. And that would be a chapter. But the honest thing, interesting thing is that, you're so busy just trying to get everything done that it's a challenge to visit all your cameras, live your life, just do all these things. So I'm not sure that I'm going to do all of Appalachia. I think it's going to be a more broader sense of, how to try to get closer to the animal. And maybe the newer reports that, I've had happen. I'm always each and every week talking to a new witness, and I still keep in touch largely with almost everybody in the past that, I've dealt with.
Yeah.
So now I'm closing in on 1,000 witnesses.
Wow.
When I did the book, the first one, I had 500 witnesses, and now it's around 1,000. But like I said, about once a year, man, you'll get one. It's compelling. It just leaves you with just no doubt in your mind, that people are seeing something, that's out there. We didn't talk about, what it could be, and I don't know what it could be. I think it's common sense that the easy thing for it to be would be Paranthropus or Gigantopithecus would be the easy things for it to be.
Right.
Because 10 to 20,000 years ago, the land bridge was open. We have fossils from those things in Asia, not Paranthropus. That would have had to came farther from South America or Africa. Sorry. And, so it seems like it makes sense. Interestingly, in the United States, they'd say, well, we don't have any fossil evidence or anything like that. Well, it takes, if you ask anybody, it takes around 10,000 years for a fossil to form on average. There could well not even be any fossils from it in North America. The land bridge might not have been open long enough.
Yeah.
In Gigantopithecus, there was hundreds and hundreds of thousands of that huge ape, and we have a garbage bag full of bones and little fragments.
Yeah,
and that's all we got.
It's like a tooth and what was it, a molar, part of the jaw?
Yeah, molars, and it's got a piece of a jaw. And I was thinking about that before I came on. Only about 20% of all animals do we have actual fossils for. Yeah. We just recently got them for chimps in the last 20 years.
Yes.
There's animals that we know for sure that exist, many of them that we don't have fossil evidence for.
Yeah.
So that's not a reasonable argument, but now I think that, if I had that advice, it would be to try to think differently, to come up with your own ideas about, how you could go about, maybe it's that you're techie and you could do something with a drone, and, drones are becoming more affordable. You can get them with thermals now, and, you can go to a wilderness area and sit in the back of your truck and in your lawn chair or whatever. And then, look in that area and maybe get something that would be compelling for people. I know that Todd Discotel, the scientist from New York University, said that he thinks that there's a way now that a Bigfoot wouldn't have to be killed in order for that to be documented. But I just don't believe personally anymore that people are going to believe it until, there's a body.
Yeah.
And I think that that'll happen. It's inevitable. I've interviewed 3 different hunters in West Virginia and 1 in Ohio that had clear shots with a gun, and did not take a shot. And I think it's inevitable that, somebody will.
Yeah. Do you think they didn't take the shot? Like, what was their reasoning? Was it because it was too human-like, or?
It was.
Yeah, that's what
it was.
Yeah, I don't think I could do that. So,
I don't think the problem is it's like, like most of us don't like snakes. Like, if you want to be in the woods, you learn to get by with them or whatever. But if someone told you there was going to be a snake coming up in 20 feet, well, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But it always catches you off guard.
Right.
And that's the worst thing. And I think that it's people go in the woods and they're not expecting to have a Bigfoot encounter of all things. And, we're just not mentally prepared for when it happens. And I can remember years ago, before we even had really coyotes in Ohio at all. And I was deer hunting with my family, and my brother-in-law told me that he had seen a coyote. And I was like, why didn't you shoot it? And of course now, you know, everybody sees coyotes all the time, but back then we didn't see any. And he's like, man, I just wasn't expecting. He said, for an instant, I just thought it was somebody's dog. And then when I realized it was just gone that quick. Yeah. And I think that that's the way that it is with, you know, with Bigfoot. I don't know how many times that I have gotten close to bears and try to get my phone out and, you know, try to get a picture of it. And it's hard to get all that thing going in the right direction. I heard Doug Hychek, the guy from Monster Quest, and I haven't met Doug yet, but he's a bright guy. And, you know, he makes the argument that we all need to go back to the old cameras where, you know, they just automatically focus. All we have to do is just pull our hand up and take a picture.
Yeah.
And, you know, last year, I think that I may have had my first sighting, and it was not a good one, but it changed what I did. And I started wearing a GoPro in the woods all the time. And, you know, I was at this, well, you know, I was at this park, and I was at the park because 2 years prior to that, two guys had a clear sighting. They were fishing. They had went into the woods just before dusk to get some firewood for a fire and ran into a Bigfoot, and both of them saw it clearly, very closely. And so you know, it's on my calendar. So here I am in that woods, and it had rained a lot the night before, and I was there the next day, and I noticed there was no cars parked there where I parked. And to get to where I was, it would have been a 3.5 mile walk through the woods for someone to get there. And when I was on the trail going in, I noticed that there was no tracks in the mud. No one had been in there or whatever. And Shade, my lab, is always with me in the woods all the time. Well, he's trained and he's off leash, but yeah, he's like maybe 20 yards in front of me all the time. And I'm carrying a leash around my neck just in case I happen to run into somebody that's afraid of dogs or something. And I came around a hillside, and in my mind, I saw it wasn't very far from me, maybe 50 or 60 yards. It was a hiker that was buff collared all the way up and down and had a backpack on. And so as soon as I saw it, I mean, just in an instant, I just whistled, you know, for Shade. Probably not even that loud. He ran right to me. I clipped him on, and probably in 5 seconds I was walking. And as soon as I started walking, I realized the trail went away from where I saw it. And it had been you ever seen those paw patches that are in the woods? You know, they're just kind of, and it was just about 2 feet above them. And as soon as I knew, I mean, probably wasn't a minute later, I was right there where it happened because I was suspicious. And there was a ridge there, and I ran up to the ridge, and I could see all the way around everywhere, and there was no hiker there. And, you know, and I'd heard my friend Matt Pruitt talk about this one time too, and I talk about this a lot. You know, when you're in the woods or even in your daily life, your brain tries to categorize stuff quickly and instantly with what it knows. And, you know, my brain instantly just said hiker. And that's the reason why I switched to wearing a GoPro, because if I'd been wearing a GoPro, then obviously I could have just went back and looked, and I would have known for sure what it was.
Yeah.
So that's why I keep that calendar. You know, keep a calendar of when you have a camera out and you don't get any action, or you get a picture. Like many times I'll get something that could be an arm, it could be a shoulder. I can just see fur, but I just can't tell what it is. You know, keep it all in your notes and make sure that you take notes all the time. I'll tell you now, man, I go back, and mine's on an iPad Pro, and every time I look through pictures or every time I come out of the woods, I'm always sit down and write. And sometimes it just may be a paragraph saying, don't go back here this time of the year. Or some other times they'll say, I feel good about this spot. Let's, you know, go back here, but try this date or whatever it happens to be. And so for instance, I had this one place in Ohio that I became friends with the ranger, the head of the park. And, you know, she had suggested places where people didn't commonly go. And so I had went in there, and there was a road that's probably like 3 or 4 miles long. And when I went in there, and it was February 3rd, and there was snow on the ground, but there was no tracks in there. So for 2 weeks, no one had been back this road, and there's no trails back there. So I just went back there and parked, and then I just headed up this creek. and I'm on both sides of the mountain on each side of me, or it's in Ohio, so let's call it a hill. I can see it's been clear cut, and judging by the base of the trees and how they look, you know, I knew it was about 20 years ago. So there's always a lot of deer in those places. And so I'm watching the deer sign pass back and forth along the creek I'm walking in. And then I get up to the head of the hollow, the hollow branches, and I'm like, this is a pretty good spot, because all at once my deer sign just disappeared, you know, and there was some pine trees where sometimes the state, when they would clear cut, they would add a pine forest. Well, pine forest can be around 10 degrees or more warmer or cooler than the surrounding environment. So a lot of times things in nature will go to those. So, you know, I'm in this hollow, my deer track stop, and I'm in a place where there's pine trees and it's winter. I'm like, this is a good spot for a camera. So I put a camera out, and as soon as I put the camera out, I hear this wood knock. And if you're familiar in the woods and you hear a wood knock, you just don't, there's just nothing else it could be.
Right.
You just know.
Yeah.
And my dog turned around and looked, you know, because he heard it too. And it was maybe 100 yards from us. And I said, that's where we're going, bub. And so, you know, I just started walking up that hollow further. And then when I got up in there, there was a steep little side hollow that came out. And I thought, if I can just slip another camera in there real quick, nothing could see me. So I, you know, because I'm usually carrying these cameras, like they have that lock on them. So it kind of makes a big loop and it's around hanging over me, kind of like a gunsling or something.
Right.
And, you know, I'm carrying a couple with me all the time. And so I got up there, I'm putting that camera out as quick. And as soon as I did it and was working on it, there was a home run knock, which, as you know, is like super loud knock close to you. And it probably wasn't 50 feet from me, but it was just in a spot I couldn't see. And, you know, so I started up that hollow a little bit farther. Then I heard that samurai chatter, which, you know, when you hear it, it's like you can hear somebody talking and it might be another language, but you just can't tell. And to me, it was something like, woo-hoo, and I could just hear that up in the woods. And my experience had been, and with witnesses, is that when you hear that, a lot of times they're rattled, they're excited, good or bad, about something. And so it was almost dark. So I left, and you know, but that's that one place, you know, I've been back in there at that time of the year continuously now, the last 2 years since it's happened. And I keep cameras in there all the time at that time of the year, trying to make sure that I maybe get a break and get lucky with it.
Wow, man. See, the closest thing I've heard to that chatter, it's what you got me on Finding Bigfoot to talk about. It sounded almost like a giggle, kind of like a laugh, but with like an Asian accent to it. You know what I mean?
Right.
But yeah, to hear something going
and
on.
There's
like
things
that.
When you're, yeah, you know, Bo, you've been in the woods, you know what is natural. Now, if you're from New York or Chicago, like you know, you're probably afraid to even be in the woods, but you know, I mean, any sound is something. I remember one time when I took a group out and there was a girl from Cleveland, a pair of sisters, and, you know, I'd walked them about 5 miles in using a red light. We got way back in the woods and I had them turn all their lights off. And it's probably the furthest they've ever been in the woods at night.
Right.
And as soon as we did, then there was an owl that started in, and, you know, like, it's not so bad if an owl is hooting, but they make weird sounds.
They do.
And that girl said, you know, what in the hell is that? And so for me, it was nothing, but, you know, the same way, like when you heard that samurai chatter, you know, you instantly recognize this is not something normal in the woods that I would hear commonly or whatever.
Yeah.
But, you know, another thing is, you know, Hukin and Sullivan was these biologists from Oregon, and they had a sighting in the 70s, and they got consumed with it, and they kept all these notes, and they kept cameras, and they'd walk with their cameras out. And I forget now, you know, how many times that they said they had sightings. So like 10 or 11, they had experiences with Bigfoot, but they had said that in their notes, it took about 200 hours to have an experience to find something. Yeah. So, you know, it's unreasonable and weird if people go out and think that every single time that they're going out, I'm suspicious that they're hearing or finding Bigfoot activity. Yeah. Because, you know, if you figure if I'm going out, you know, 6 or 8 hours a couple times a week, it's about 2 months before I hear something or find something.
Yeah.
and I think that would be more common. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are interested in the woo type thing, is because, who wants to walk for like 200 hours and hear nothing?
Right. Yeah. They want that
But,
experience.
the one park that I grew up in Ohio, the most remote park there, grew up hunting there all the time as a child. When I didn't know anything about Bigfoot, I hiked for 4 months, hundreds and hundreds of hours before, of course, this is all during the day, before I heard anything.
Yeah.
But that it's sometimes there's large areas and you just don't know where they're at, and you just had to bump. Once I knew and had heard it the first time, then every year I could go back and maybe get something around that same time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like when I worked at Chief Logan Park, I worked there for about 4 years while I was going back to school, and I was in the woods for my job. I was clearing trails or running the wildlife exhibit. Like I said, I did that for about 4 years. And then on my days off, I was still up there hiking or, fishing at the ponds and stuff. And I could probably count on both hands how many times I've heard anything or something sounded suspect. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's probably a couple thousand hours easy.
Yeah. In a primo place.
Yeah. Yeah. In a great location. So I don't expect to ever go out and find anything off the bat.
I remember hearing Wood Knox one, I think it was called Rattlesnake Trail in Chief Logan.
Yep.
And then I remember if you're fishing at the pond and you're facing the lake, from the road in, and if you look straight in front of you on that highest hill, that's part of, I'm trying to think what that trail called, that comes up the backside from the ranger's office and goes all the way around. It comes out by the pond.
Let's see. I used to be able to rattle them all off. But
I know that's the way with me. It's escaping me, but it's relatively close to that area. But I would stand up there many times, and you can look down and see that parking lot.
Yep.
But to walk there is 45 minutes or an hour hard walk. And I always wondered how many times did something stand right there where I was watching all those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's,
and you get that feeling every once in a while.
Thing, man. It's fun to think about that there's something left out there for us to discover.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if it all washes out, and the mystery is solved or whatever, there's not going to be a minute wasted. It's fun. It's something fun to think about and to get into. So, and like you said, it gets you outside.
It gets you outside. Some of my
therapy.
best friends are Bigfooters.
Yeah.
So, it's shaped part of my life, which people would probably find weird. But, I think a lot of times if people haven't had something that shaped their life, then, you have to kind of wonder then, like,
yeah, what are you doing?
Shouldn't there be a little something more for you out of life?
Yeah. Like, what are you doing with your life if you're not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever it is that shaped it.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. Well,
I appreciate you, Bo.
I appreciate you too, Russ. Again, I apologize for things not working out the first time.
Oh, no, my friend.
But I think this was even better.
Well, good. I'm glad.
So if anything comes up, if you want to tell the people that call in to you, if it don't make the report or whatever on BFRO, you can still send them my way. I'd like to talk to them too.
Okay.
Anytime.
Yeah, I know you and I had talked about that there were some places down in Logan, some place that you wanted, you thought there might be a place to go out, and I'd like to get down there and spend some time with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I got a lot of time this summer, so I'm working from home, as you can tell.
There you go.
Holler at me.
All right. I will talk to you later, Bo.
All right, brother. Thanks.
Have a good one, my friend.
You too.